Officer Richard Cole had always been the kind of man people in the neighborhood trusted without question. He had been in the police force for nearly 20 years, rising through the ranks and collecting commendations along the way. His broad shoulders, square jaw, and steady stare fit the image of a man who stood for safety and authority. To outsiders, he looked like the very definition of stability. He attended church on Sundays, shook hands at community meetings, and spoke proudly about protecting families. He liked to project the picture of a man who lived by values, a man who others could rely on. But appearances can be carefully crafted masks. Behind closed doors, Richard carried something much darker. He held prejudices he never voiced in public but often whispered in private. He had grown up with a narrow view of the world, one where lines of race and class were never meant to be crossed. Over the years, the badge he wore gave him power and respect, but it also hardened the anger inside him. He felt superior, even when he hid it behind a smile. What people didn't know was that the cop they admired harbored thoughts that would one day lead him to destruction. The calm rhythm of Richard's life began to change when Maya Johnson moved into the house next door. She was young, barely into her 20s, and her energy carried into the street with a kind of brightness that couldn't be ignored. Maya had moved in with her aunt while finishing her nursing studies, and her presence seemed to draw attention wherever she went. Her laugh was easy, her kindness obvious, and her determination to make something of herself inspired those who knew her. For Richard, however, Maya's arrival stirred emotions he couldn't admit. At first, it was irritation. He noticed the way neighbors welcomed her warmly, the way she carried herself with quiet confidence. It was a reminder of a world he claimed to despise. Yet, as he watched from his porch or behind his blinds, something else began to grow, something stronger than his resentment. Desire crept into the cracks of his thoughts. He told himself it was curiosity, but it wasn't. He was drawn to her in a way that unsettled him, and the conflict between his prejudices and his attraction created a dangerous storm inside him. Richard was careful not to reveal his interest at first. He maintained his rigid posture as the proud officer, giving her only short nods when their paths crossed. But in the privacy of his mind, he built scenarios, imagined moments, and fought against impulses that only seemed to tighten their grip on him. The more he tried to suppress them, the more they consumed him. The badge on his chest, the reputation he had cultivated, the picture of perfection, all of it began to feel fragile, as though one wrong move could shatter it forever. Maya, unaware of the intensity of his fixation, lived her days as normally as possible. She studied late into the night, visited friends on weekends, and sometimes sat on her porch with a book in her hands, enjoying the warm evenings. Richard often found excuses to be outside at the same time, pretending to water his lawn or check his car, always finding a way to keep her within sight. What he told himself was harmless observation was already an obsession taking root. The perfect image Richard had spent decades crafting was starting to crack. Behind the clean-cut uniform and polished reputation was a man wrestling with secrets, a man on the edge of choices that would lead him down a path of no return. What began as passing encounters soon turned into something far more dangerous. Richard Cole used his position as a police officer to mask his intentions, presenting himself as a helpful neighbor. He offered to check the locks on Maya's doors, to watch her car at night, to make sure she felt safe in the neighborhood. At first, his gestures seemed small, even polite, but behind every act of kindness was a plan. Richard wasn't driven by goodwill. He was testing boundaries, seeing how close he could get without raising suspicion. Maya accepted his help at the beginning without a second thought. She knew he was a police officer and assumed his interest in her safety was simply part of his duty. But Richard's visits became more frequent. He began lingering on her porch, asking questions that felt too personal, finding reasons to step inside her home. He cloaked it all under the excuse of being protective, but the truth was that his control over her life was already growing. The affair began quietly, almost like an accident. One late evening, after helping her carry groceries inside, Richard stayed longer than usual. His confidence and authority seemed overwhelming, and Maya, young and still learning to navigate her independence, found herself pulled into his orbit. The relationship that followed was secretive and intoxicating in the beginning, but it carried a weight neither of them fully understood. For Maya, it felt like a strange mix of flattery and unease. For Richard, it was never about love. It was about dominance. Richard told himself he deserved this. He convinced himself that no one would ever find out, that he could maintain the image of the loyal husband and decorated cop while feeding his hidden obsession. The thrill of secrecy fueled him, but it also poisoned his thoughts. His prejudices, the same ones he carried for years, didn't disappear. They twisted the affair into something darker, something built not on affection but on control and contradiction. He despised the very thing he desired, and that contradiction festered inside him like a wound. As weeks turned into months, Richard's obsession only intensified. He demanded more of Maya's time, growing angry if she didn't answer his calls or texts. He insisted she avoid certain friends, telling her they were a bad influence, though his real motive was isolation. His badge gave him leverage, a silent threat that loomed in every interaction. Maya began to feel trapped, her initial attraction overshadowed by unease. What had started as curiosity now felt like a cage she couldn't escape. Meanwhile, Richard's fear of discovery haunted him. He knew what would happen if the truth came out. His family would collapse, his career would be ruined, and his reputation would shatter. He lived in constant tension, torn between the thrill of secrecy and the terror of exposure. But instead of pulling away, he tightened his grip on Maya, determined to control every part of her life. The affair was no longer just a hidden relationship. It had become a dangerous secret. Every encounter carried risk, every moment felt like a step closer to disaster. Richard's mask of perfection was slipping, and beneath it was a man ruled by obsession, paranoia, and a need for power that would soon consume them both. The illusion of control could not last forever. Richard Cole's affair with Maya began leaving marks that others could not ignore. Neighbors noticed small details, the late-night visits, the way his patrol car sometimes sat in front of her house long after his shift had ended. To most it was suspicious, but not yet damning. To Richard's wife, however, the signs were far more clear. She felt the growing distance between them, the way he avoided her questions, the sudden bursts of temper that came without warning. The man who once seemed composed was unraveling in front of her eyes. At the police department, Richard's reputation also began to slip. He had always been praised for his discipline and focus, but colleagues started to see changes. He was short-tempered during patrols, reckless in confrontations, and careless with reports. One violent arrest landed him a formal complaint, something that stained the record he had polished for years. Supervisors began to watch him more closely, and whispers spread through the station. A man who had once been untouchable was beginning to show cracks in his armor. Maya, too, was noticing a shift. The man who had once carried himself with charm now seemed different, obsessive, controlling, unpredictable. His questions became demands. His concern turned into surveillance. He wanted to know where she was at all times, who she was with, and how long she would be gone. When she didn't answer quickly enough, he appeared at her door, using his badge as both excuse and threat. His presence, once comforting, now filled her with dread. Her attempts to create distance only made things worse. When she told him she needed space to focus on her studies, he accused her of betrayal. When she visited friends, he showed up uninvited, watching from his car like a shadow she couldn't escape. The power imbalance between them grew heavier, pressing down on her with each passing day. Maya began to fear that ending the affair would not only damage Richard's life, but could also put her own safety at risk. The tension between them bled into the neighborhood. Some residents whispered about the officer's unusual attachment to the young woman next door, though none dared confront him directly. His authority as a cop made him untouchable in their eyes. Maya's aunt, though supportive, had no idea of the depth of Richard's control, believing her niece was simply stressed from school. But behind closed doors, Maya lived with the weight of his obsession, unsure of how to escape without provoking him. Richard, meanwhile, convinced himself he was losing everything. His wife's coldness, his colleagues' suspicion, and Maya's growing resistance fueled his paranoia. He believed he was being cornered, trapped by forces that wanted to expose him. Instead of accepting responsibility, he shifted blame onto Maya, telling himself she was the reason for his downfall. The twisted logic only made him more dangerous. By this point, the cracks in Richard's carefully built life were no longer small. They were deep fractures spreading through every part of his world. His family, his career, and his secret relationship were all slipping beyond his control. The pressure was building toward something explosive, and the perfect image he had spent years protecting was about to collapse in the most violent way imaginable. The summer night carried a heavy stillness, the kind that made every sound sharper, every movement more noticeable. Maya had spent the day quietly preparing herself for a decision she had dreaded for weeks. She had finally chosen to break free from Richard's grip. The secrecy, the threats, and the growing fear had become unbearable. She told herself it was time to leave the neighborhood, to start fresh in a new city where his influence could not reach her. She packed some of her belongings into boxes, planning to move in with a cousin out of town. To Maya, this was survival. To Richard, it would be the ultimate betrayal. When Richard discovered her plans, his world collapsed in an instant. He had convinced himself that he controlled every detail of their relationship, that she was too bound by fear to ever walk away. But the thought of losing her, and worse, the thought of being exposed, ignited a rage inside him that he could not contain. He told himself she had used him, that she was ready to destroy everything he had built. The contradictions twisted into a dangerous storm, feeding his paranoia until violence became, in his mind, the only solution. That evening, neighbors noticed his patrol car parked further down the street, hidden in the shadows. Richard waited for the right moment, watching as lights in Maya's house flickered off one by one. Just past midnight, he left his car and walked briskly across the quiet street, his fists clenched, his mind consumed with a single thought: she would not leave him. He forced his way through the door, the crash echoing in the silence of the night. Inside, the confrontation escalated with terrifying speed. Maya, startled and frightened, tried to push him away, but Richard's fury was overwhelming. The rage he had bottled for years erupted as he attacked, driven not by love but by fear of losing control. The scene became chaotic and brutal, every moment heavier than the last. The house, once filled with Maya's quiet determination and hope, turned into a battleground of violence. Outside, neighbors heard the disturbance. Some thought it was just a loud argument, others a burglary, but no one intervened. They had seen Richard's temper before, and many were too afraid to interfere with a police officer. By the time the noise subsided, the damage had already been done. The life Maya had fought to protect was stolen in a storm of blood and violence. Richard stood over what he had done, his chest heaving, the weight of reality crashing down on him. He tried to piece together a plan, scrambling to justify the unthinkable. He told himself he could cover it up, that his badge and authority would protect him. But no amount of training or reputation could erase the evidence of what had just occurred. His hands, his uniform, the room itself, all bore the marks of a crime that could never be hidden. The night ended not with resolution, but with a chilling silence. The summer air grew heavier, the neighborhood unaware that the officer they had once trusted had crossed a line from which there was no return. Richard Cole had destroyed everything in a single night of violence, and the truth was only beginning to unravel. The morning after the violence, the quiet street awoke to an unease no one could explain. Maya's aunt, returning home after a night shift, found the door ajar and the living room in disarray. At first, she thought it was a break-in, but the grim reality soon revealed itself. Within minutes, sirens pierced the neighborhood as police cars and ambulances crowded the street. Officers moved quickly, but the scene inside left little doubt. Maya's life had been brutally cut short. At the beginning, Richard Cole attempted to control the narrative. He was, after all, one of them, a seasoned officer with decades of service and a reputation that carried weight. He told investigators he had been on a late-night patrol when he saw suspicious activity at Maya's house. He claimed he had tried to intervene, only to find her already attacked by an intruder. His badge and his voice carried authority, but the evidence spoke louder. Detectives began piecing together the truth. Surveillance footage from a nearby home captured Richard's patrol car parked down the street that night. Forensic teams found his fingerprints on the broken door and his DNA throughout the crime scene. Even more telling were the text messages uncovered on Maya's phone, messages filled with demands, threats, and pleas that painted a clear picture of a dangerous, obsessive relationship. The heroic officer's story began to unravel thread by thread. The revelations stunned the community. Neighbors who once waved to Richard now spoke of the strange late-night visits, the controlling behavior, and the arguments overheard through thin walls. His wife, broken and humiliated, filed for divorce within days of his arrest, admitting she had long suspected something was wrong, but never imagined the truth was this dark. Colleagues at the station, some defensive at first, quickly distanced themselves as the evidence became undeniable. The man they had once trusted was no longer a brother in blue, but a murderer hiding behind a badge. The trial was swift and devastating. Prosecutors laid out the affair in painful detail, showing how Richard's obsession with Maya escalated into threats and, finally, violence. Witnesses testified about his temper and his declining behavior in the months leading up to the crime. The defense tried to argue stress and emotional instability, but the jury saw through every attempt to soften the brutality of his actions. The photographs of the crime scene, the messages, and the timeline left no room for doubt. When the verdict was read, Richard Cole sat motionless, stripped of the authority he had once wielded so confidently. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His name, once tied to respect and service, became synonymous with betrayal and cruelty. The decorated officer had fallen further than anyone thought possible. For the community, the case left scars that would not fade quickly. Maya was remembered as a bright young woman with dreams of helping others, a life stolen before it had truly begun. For Richard, prison walls became the final stage of his downfall, a cage that reflected the twisted obsession that destroyed him. His story served as a chilling reminder. Even those who appear to protect and serve can hide the darkest secrets, and sometimes the danger lies closest to home.